Well, my dear viewer, bad news. It turns out that we're not carnivores. So if you thought that you were a carnivore, it turns out that both of us were incorrect. According to Dr. Rob Cywes, MD, PhD, hashtag Carb-Addiction Doc. Purportedly, because this person claims to be a carb addiction specialist and also continues to tell people, apparently, to continue consuming carbohydrates. Where the hell did that come from? It actually started about a year or two ago, but he's back on the train. It died off for a minute, and now we're back on it. So we're going to go ahead and check out his video called Why Humans Are Not Carnivores, and we're going to put him right where he's wrong, which is, well, with a claim as absurd as that, I presume, throughout the entire video. So let's just get into it. Waste no further time.
Hi folks, Dr. Rob Cywes. I am the Carb-Addiction Doc, and this is going to be,
well, purportedly, like we said. We already covered that.
Most hated video.
Well, hate is a strong word. I'm going to disapprove of it strongly. It might be your most disapproved of video. And I presume for correct reasons, valid reasons, okay? Substantiated reasoning, Rob. I've had no problem with you in the past. I didn't really appreciate your coverage of the Randall cycle. I've never really watched you too much, but yeah, I didn't think it was going to get this bad.
I am wearing the animal hat because...
Yes, which is also ironic, considering the fact that that is a documentary you featured in, which is all about carnivore. A carnivore diet approach. You featured in that documentary. Now here you are making a video called Why Humans Are Not Carnivores. Anyway, a little ironic.
And I love this. I love the animal movie that's about to drop in June. Please.
Well, maybe it's because you have a vested interest in being in the movie. Because you're completely discounting what you said in the movie. Unless you're going to sit here and say that carnivore is only great temporarily. Which, you know what, on a logical basis, in isolation, that argument could be true. But let's hear your reasoning behind it, because that's not going to substantiate that claim.
Get ready for it. Please watch it. It is fantastic. I myself am heavily carnivore based. So is my son. So is...
Okay, well, I already know what's going to happen here. I already know what I'm going to say. And that is, you're not carnivore based. You are carnivore still, by anthropological definitions. You still are. Because I already have an idea of what you're going to say in this video. I have an idea of what your conclusions are as to how people should be eating. Your reasoning, I sort of also have another idea about, but we'll see.
My whole family is carnivore based. Carnivore based.
Well, we just covered that.
I'm not pure 100% carnivore. So
okay, well, this is a sort of begging the question fallacy in the first place. If you're consuming 99% animal-based foods, you're still carnivore. You can't be. That's not called being 99% carnivore. That's called being a carnivore.
His video is...
And by the way, everyone is a carnivore. Every single person is a carnivore. It's just whether or not they're eating a diet congruous with a carnivore's indicated diet for their specific genome, because all carnivores are different, therefore they have different diets. But you're not carnivore-based. You are a carnivore. Now, whether or not you eat a carnivore approach that is most congruent with your species-appropriate, species-specific diet, as inferred from multiple different inferences, hard scientific inferences, that's a different question.
Discuss why a pure carnivore diet long-term...
Define that, because there's many different variations of that. Frankly, that's your first misstep, and that's a major, major misstep. What was the diet made up of, and how was one consuming it? And what other behaviors were they engaging in and not engaging in?
Is an anti-human...
Oh, wow. Is an anti-human. Wow. Okay, so we're actually going there. Anti-human. I'll tell you what's anti-human, Rob. Making convicting claims about things that have no ability to be convicting about. No ability to be informed upon to a remotely significant or sufficient degree to warrant a convicting claim surrounding it. That is deadly. What am I really referring to? On an abstract level, I'm referring to asserting causality when it cannot be asserted, based on associations, weak or strong, okay? Which you just did, by the way, when you said a carnivore diet approach long-term. Define long-term, Rob. That's another thing. Define long-term. The word is an anti-human diet, whatever. Is, wow. Seriously, because if your insinuation here by saying anti-human is that it's deleterious long-term, to say is, well, that's a causal claim based on what type of diet. You said a carnivore diet. There's not just one. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of different variations, if not more than that. Technically speaking, there are a myriad of possible combinations. Okay, this is silly, Rob. That is an egregious claim right off the bat. Oh, we're in for a ride.
Bad idea.
Well, that's your opinion. Okay, the facts are that the diet that best approximates, given our modern world that we live in, our species-appropriate, species-specific diet with very minimal variation because of the fact that we're all the same species. Some variation, fine, because human beings are the most ubiquitous species on planet Earth because of our ability to reason and all that stuff. So we've evolved in different environments depending on your ancestral lineage, etc., etc. Minimal variation, given, fine, is a carnivore approach. Carnivore being basically, technically speaking, a ratio of 70 to 30 or greater of animal products to plant-derived products. But from every inference we have, we should be consuming a lot higher of a ratio than that, okay? So there is some nuance, and I've covered that, but the fact is that every single person of the human genome that has ever been studied for any remotely significant or really insignificant amount of time has shown that the requirement for exogenous carbohydrates, at least in those members of our species, is zero, always. Now, by that logic alone, that doesn't mean necessarily that there aren't benefits to consuming carbohydrates, and that leads into a separate argument, which is, okay, now establish a bona fide benefit of consuming carbohydrates informed upon by any piece of scientific literature. But anyway, getting tangential here. So anyway, Rob, that goes for, again, from every hard inference that we refer to, our biochemistry, our physiology, comparative anatomy, observational paleoanthropology, some chemical anthropology as well, it is safe long-term. Because why wouldn't it be if we consumed it for millions of years throughout every single member's entire lifespan, really? Of course, with some very minimal fibrous tubers whenever hunts weren't successful. So...
Okay. Let me back up a little bit.
Yeah, a lot, actually. Let's really... And you know what? Instead of just backing up, you should have just deleted that part of your video and really not ever posted this and made it in the first place, because this is inane nonsense.
Pure carnivore, going 100% high-fat carnivore...
Well, first of all, there's another misstep. Remember when we said there's multiple different variations of carnivores? Some people do higher protein than high fat, and some people do higher fat than higher protein, depending on their requirements, because of genotypic and phenotypic differences, different behaviors that they engage in on a regular basis, appetite regulation. See that? See how you're just making a general claim about the entirety of a carnivore dietary approach based on one, not even well-defined carnivore variation. You said high fat. Well, high is a relative term. What do you mean by high? Anyway.
The most rapid, effective way to correct insulin resistance.
Okay, so another begging the question fallacy here. Insulin resistance in any form, whether it be peripheral/physiological insulin resistance, or whether it be what's colloquially called pathological insulin resistance, typically found in obese people, both of those are not pathological. So the second one, the latter, that is colloquially deemed pathological insulin resistance, is not pathological. Insulin resistance is exactly what the body is supposed to do given the circumstances, okay? If you believe the fundamental tenet of health, well, not the, but a fundamental tenet of health, that being that all disease is caused by external factors that are incongruous with what our genes are evolved genotypically to withstand throughout our evolutionary past, then insulin resistance is not the problem, because that phenomenon is encoded for by the genes of the body. Those genes having evolved for billions of years, okay? Billions. Over 3 billion, it seems, okay? The problem in what's called pathological insulin resistance, because it is, that form of insulin resistance is associated with bona fide problems, damage to the person's physiology, already existing damage as well, and an increased adiposity that is more likely than not indicative of a problem, is lots of things, but a really conducive way of achieving that is eating a mixed meal of fatty acids and carbohydrates and protein multiple times a day, every single day for the rest of your life, for years on end, really. Okay? That's the problem. Now, once again, to allude back to what I said in the beginning, what is the exact required amount of carbohydrates, exogenous carbohydrates, for human beings from every inference we have? A pretty strong one being our efficiency for gluconeogenesis in the first place. It's zero. Okay, we're done.
So if you have weight to lose, if you have diabetes, if you have bad heart disease,
as opposed to good heart disease?
One diabetic, Pure carnivore is the ideal, fastest way to lose weight and correct type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so this is another begging the... Everyone begs the question, don't they? Okay. Is the reason that you should go on a carnivore diet because of those reasons? Because you're sick? No. The reason that you ought to do it is because from every inference we have, it is your species appropriate, our species appropriate, species specific diet. Or once again, given our modern world, the diet, or the dietary approach I should say, don't want to make the same mistake as Rob Cywes here, and many other influencers when I say that best approximates that, okay? Whether you're sick or not, Rob. And the reason that I'm putting this out there is because your implication when you say that, whether you realize it or not, is, well, once those things are over with, then you can go back to doing whatever the you were doing before. No, the diet is appropriate if you're a human being, and you ought to be on it if you are a human being, okay? We all fail to meet the ideal, okay? So some people might have a few berries here and there, okay? Fine, whatever. That's not really going to do anything too bad for you. The problem is saying that since it won't be too bad for you, then therefore that's totally indicated and fine, because then the line shifts even further every single time you do that, until eventually you're back on a standard diet, okay? You shouldn't be eating those berries, okay? Don't do it.
To be able to manage type 1 diabetes at a very low insulin utilization, very effective, healthy way.
Well, yeah, which makes sense considering the fact that you're not dumping a bunch of exogenous carbohydrates down your throat and into your body. So how much insulin do you actually require when you're not doing that? Not too much. You still need some.
However.
No, not however, Rob.
Human beings physiologically cannot...
Tell us all about human physiology. Cannot sustain? Is that what he's about to say?
...in a pure carnivore diet.
Okay, so already, before you even say the rest of your sentence, ridiculous. Nonsense. Rob?
Long term.
Define long term. Without what?
Becoming insulin suppressed. And here's what...
Okay, define insulin suppression, Rob. Basically what Rob means by insulin suppression is that if you go on a carnivore diet, you're not going to be releasing sufficient insulin to meet your physiological needs, like thyroid hormone production and subsequent function, electrolyte maintenance. Those are really the two main ones, aren't they? Which is nonsense, Rob. Carbohydrates are the most insulinogenic macronutrient, and there is a question as to whether or not that is precisely because of glucose's toxicity. Okay, there's a question. I'm not making any convicting claims. See, that's the difference between, you know, people like me and then every other health influencer online that tries to fearmonger. There is a question, okay? We know that glucose is toxic. We don't, above a certain physiological concentration in the bloodstream. We do know that for a fact. The problem is drawing from that the claim that necessarily that means that that's why it's the most insulinogenic. Perhaps. And there is, I'm actually pretty convinced, but it's hard to say because we can't go back and trace our entire evolutionary existence and perform a longitudinal study that lasts for billions of years. So, yeah, or really millions of years. So, anyway, we can't even really manage decades, can we? Once in a while, here and there you do, but anyway.
So in this video, I'm going to compare obligate carnivores.
You mean like human beings? There is an argument to be had that we're facultative. However, given people's presentation on a vegan diet long term being, let's define that. My definition of long term is 2 or 3 years and up. I would say that it seems that we are obligate hypercarnivores, not facultative hypercarnivores. People that don't know the difference, obligate means that you actually require a carnivorous diet for optimal health and function. You can't survive without eating a carnivorous approach. Facultative means that you can survive at fully sufficient health status, but you can also be a carnivore. You have the faculties to be a carnivore. I lean towards the obligate realm. I really do. But we have some capacity to live on a standard diet, for example, that is a mix of all those things. It's just, yeah, you might be able to do that for 2-3 decades maybe, and then watch what happens.
Species that have evolved to be pure carnivore.
You mean like human beings, okay? This isn't up for debate, okay? And I'm all up for devil's advocate and playing both sides and really purveying the truth and being content with wherever the truth guides me, the ideological position that it guides me to, okay? I have tried to steelman every argument. And no, I haven't tried. I've done so. I really have. And they don't hold up. They don't.
Compare them to human beings that have evolved toward carnivore but are still omnicarnivore.
No. What the hell is that, Rob? This is ridiculous nonsense.
Explain why.
Let's get into the reasoning, the pseudo reasoning.
Let's go through this.
Let's do it.
In carnivores, as well as humans,
Well, wow, these tacit sort of insertions there to mislead people into believing that we're not carnivores. It's amazing, okay? Whether I like it or not, we are, okay? I would love to feel great about myself eating sweet potatoes and carrots all the time. Well, sorry, where did carrots come from? I hate carrots. I've always hated them. Broccoli, that's what I meant. I love broccoli. I love the taste of broccoli. I'd love to feel good about myself and feel like I'm doing myself a favor by eating those things. They taste good. Okay, but I've gone years without eating vegetables and fruit. I've gone even longer without eating fruit than I have without vegetables. So anyway, it's just the facts aren't there. And there's two primary inferences that I point to that are very, very hard inferences. Well, actually, you know what? Three. But the first two I'm thinking of are more prominent than are more damning, you could say, than the third one.
Is the hormone that we have to use to get sugar into our bloodstream, and both carnivores...
No. Insulin is not the hormone that you require to get glucose into your bloodstream. Glucose enters the bloodstream through the duodenum after, well, being derived from sucrose through the enzyme sucrase, or if it was just broken down by amylase enzymes into glucose from starches. And it flows right into the bloodstream almost instantly. Okay, insulin is not required for that. Insulin is required to usher glucose into cells for glycogen resynthesis, aerobic glycolysis. There's no such thing, but that's why I'm putting it in quotes. We're really talking about pyruvate oxidation, but for simplicity's sake, okay? Glucose's conversion into fat, okay, effectively by creating acetyl-CoA and causing a buildup of citrate in the mitochondria, which then migrates to the cytosol and blah, blah, blah. Insulin is required for triglyceride synthesis. At least it upregulates the process. I don't believe it's necessarily required, but to create fat and then turn that fat into triglycerides for subsequent storage. Okay, insulin is very important in our body. Okay, without insulin, we would waste away. We actually see that with people that don't stimulate sufficient insulin on a carnivore diet, which, yes, you may have some difficulty doing such a thing, depending on the way that you are embarking upon such an approach. But anyway.
And humans, omnicarnivores.
Oh, okay, so you're drawing this distinction as if we're separate, which we're not. So.
Require sugar at a low level in our cells.
Yes. And I just did a video on this. The way that our bodies require glucose is exclusively anaerobically. Exclusively anaerobically. Rob, what does that mean? It means that you do not require glucose ever for ATP produced in the mitochondria. Ever. You don't. You require glucose to produce ATP elsewhere for muscle contractions, brain function, specifically in astrocytes, which are a type of glial cell in the brain. So not neurons. Neurons can go their entire lives without glucose. Okay? Fact. Liver cells, but not for their own processes, but to release glucose into the bloodstream through glycogenolysis, because there's a storage of glycogen in your liver. Sorry, not here. Here. Okay, during things like intense exercise or fasting. When you fast for a while, your glycogen stores in your liver basically are completely depleted because, well, there's no requirement for it, okay? And you also require glucose through glycolysis in erythrocytes, a type of red blood cell. So your blood cells require glucose because they don't have mitochondria in the first place. So you can't oxidize fat if you don't have mitochondria. Fat won't be able to be used to create energy. Neither will ketones. You need glucose for that. So your red blood cells take up a lot of glucose regularly. Fortunately, we have a process in our bodies called gluconeogenesis, and our efficiency for such a process is that of hypercarnivores, okay?
And there are certain cells that have to have sugar.
Yes, I just listed them.
So the issue is not the use of sugar. This is not a discussion about whether sugar is needed or not.
Okay, yes, if you do not have carbohydrates in your body, you will die. You will die. You will be... The first thing that will go is your brain, and the second thing that will go is your muscles. You will succumb to irreversible rigor and die. So no need for rigor mortis to set in. You'll have already caused rigor, okay?
Both species produce sugar in the liver by gluconeogenesis.
And the kidneys. And also there's a small capacity, a very small capacity, fun fact, by the brain. And the small intestine.
If humans are 100% carnivore and carnivore animals are 100% carnivore, we produce sugar.
Yes, precisely correct, Rob. So what is the problem here? Well, we already know what he's going to get at, which is, well, fine, you produce all the glucose you require, but it doesn't mean that you will stimulate sufficient insulin for your physiological needs. And we'll get to that.
We produce sugar through gluconeogenesis. Both livers, under the influence of glucagon, are very effective at that.
Yes. Also, the influence of acetyl-CoA from fatty acid oxidation in the liver, allosterically.
In order to get the sugar into the majority of cells, you need insulin.
No, Rob. Wow. This is amazing, okay? Insulin is required for glucose to be administered into cells through GLUT4, okay? Muscle cells, primarily, if you didn't know, Rob, are deriving their glucose from GLUT1 transporters, okay? Which are glucose dependent, not insulin dependent, okay? You don't require glucose to be used in cells through insulin exclusively. False, Rob. Wow! Okay, just a little crash course for you, my dear viewer. There are 4 primary GLUT transporters. There's 14 in total, but most of those are involved not with glucose flux, but with things like, in the case of GLUT5, fructose flux and administration. 4 primary GLUT transporters, GLUT1 through 4. The first 3, GLUT1 through 3, are glucose dependent, meaning their activity and their expression, so the amount that you have, their efficiency as well as their amount, is dependent on the concentration of glucose. Okay, GLUT4 has their efficiency and their amount influenced by insulin. They're insulin dependent. The others are glucose dependent. Rob? Wow!
You need insulin.
Yes, you need insulin. That claim in isolation is totally correct. You've gotten it completely wrong as to how we need insulin, though. Okay, Rob? Nonsense.
Okay? And both species are very good at producing insulin.
Okay, Rob, you are drawing a false distinction once again, and I'm going to call it out every single time you do it. You're talking about both species, quote unquote, sets of species. You're talking about a set of species, and then you're extracting humans from that. So species plural and then species singular is what you're talking about. You should lump them all in together because we're all carnivores, okay? Even with your own conclusions, we're still carnivores. Rob, okay? Oh, you should have 20 to 50 grams of carbohydrates a day. That's still carnivore, isn't it? Even just technically speaking. This is why just because something is carnivore doesn't mean it's appropriate. And I've said this on the channel all the time. Dairy is carnivore, but it's not necessarily appropriate, especially depending on your genotype and phenotype, especially if you don't have the lactase enzyme and you don't deal with casein well, okay? Eating 50 grams of carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates with your food, well, that's carnivore, isn't it? This isn't about carnivore. This is about indication level. It just happens to be the case that your indication, the level of indication for a dietary approach for human beings is carnivorous, okay?
Not an issue.
Well, there we go. You should have just ended your video right there. Not an issue. Not an issue. Very good at producing insulin. Good. Great. What's next?
But the question, the big difference comes from what triggers insulin release.
Okay, well, it turns out that every single macronutrient, fatty acids, protein, and carbohydrates help in releasing insulin. Thank you very much, Rob. We're done.
This is where the evolutionary adaptation of pure carnivores is beyond that of humans.
Okay. Let's see your reasoning for that, because there is a video that I did a while back talking about the nuance here. Let's see how you misrepresent this.
So, in pure carnivores, protein, amino acids in the intestine, because they're eating meat,
Yes.
where they're eating meat and fat.
Yeah, just like human beings.
Protein stimulates 90+% of their insulin secretion.
Okay, so what study are you deriving that from? What was the sample size? What was the signal to noise ratio surrounding that? Which carnivore species are we talking about? Okay, and even if you're talking about only one, which would be a problem in and of itself, by the way, okay, because all carnivores are different. Let's say that you were still dealing with one. Even amongst that species, there are phenotypic and genotypic differences. Okay, you're referring to a scientific study now, because you just referenced a statistic, or perhaps even a population parameter. Okay, Rob? Now you're talking about statistical inference. So we were on physiology, which I know quite a bit of, and now we've shifted all the way to statistical inference, okay? Something I also know quite a bit of. So tell us about the specifics, Rob.
A little bit coming from glycerol and fatty acids.
Okay, there are plenty of carnivores that are clearly designed to eat more protein than fat in terms of the ratio, a higher protein to fat ratio. Okay, other carnivores are different.
So certain amino acids from digested protein, especially arginine, leucine, lysine, and glutamine, four of the common amino acids, directly stimulate insulin release from the pancreas. That is an evolutionary adaptation by pure carnivore animals. Those are your wolves, your lions.
So like human beings as well, because those same amino acids are insulinogenic in human beings. Look it up, Rob.
Your cats, your eagles, your alligators, your snakes, all the pure carnivore animals, whether they're reptilian, amphibian, or mammalian.
So what, Rob? We got it.
Or avian. They have evolved that amino acids from digested protein directly stimulates insulin release in a dose-appropriate way.
Well, define dose appropriate. But anyway, fine. It does the same thing in human beings as well, Rob.
In humans, protein meals...
No, you know what? I'm going to pause it right there. So he said, his sentence isn't finished. In humans, protein meals... Okay, why am I pausing right now? When he says in humans eating a modern diet and they're therefore phenotypically adapted to a modern diet? What humans, Rob? Seriously, Rob, what humans are we talking about? What was the sample size? Was this a meta-analysis aggregating a bunch of other studies? Because that means that you have to look at the integrity of each individual study. Why? Because you have to look and see if the methods were the exact same. Because if they weren't, well, then you're getting a study, aren't you? And you also have to look to see if it was cherry-picked. Did you only pick 5 studies on the topic to form your meta-analysis out of the 30 that there may have been? Jesus. Wow. This is amazing.
Cause a small rise in insulin. About 10 to 20% of our insulin production or insulin release is triggered directly by amino acids.
All right, so we already covered that, didn't we? In what humans? How many humans? Was this a population inference, which means that it's completely inappropriate? But that also means it's a standard error. What was the standard error? And what were the standard deviations for all of your individual studies if it was a meta-analysis? See, this is what... Or your sample that you had if you just conducted one study, and if it was one study, then you can't extrapolate the results to every single human being. Okay, Rob, this is absolutely ridiculous. Here's another question to ask. Let's say that it is a smaller increase in insulin compared to other hypercarnivores. Let's say that we could actually make that inference and extrapolate that inference to every single human being on the face of the earth. Okay, it's not a matter of the degree of insulin. It's a matter of whether or not the degree to which insulin is secreted in response to protein ingestion is sufficient for our physiological requirements, primarily, thyroid hormone production and function and electrolyte maintenance, Rob. To answer that question, well, you would need to provide a longitudinal prospective cohort study that shows a large amount of hypercarnivores, people consuming, or at least reporting to be consuming, there's limitations with all of these studies, a carnivorous approach that is best approximating a species-appropriate, species-specific dietary approach for years, eating nothing else, that prove that the carnivore cohort, if you're going to compare it to a standard cohort or whatever, develops problems that are actually presentable, so they present with issues, not, oh, you have a blood test reading that indicates this. If they're not symptomatic, then shut the They don't have an issue. You're obligated to not intervene in those circumstances, according to the Hippocratic Oath. They're actually presenting with actual problems that are representative, indicative, necessarily of poor insulin secretion in response to protein. And then you have to say you have to prove that was necessarily the result of them consuming. You have to necessarily prove that that's the result of us not being able to secrete sufficient insulin in response to protein. Because there's still a question there, even with that, as to whether or not the people were consuming sufficient protein in the first place. Is it the fact that we just can't secrete enough insulin in response to protein, or was it just because they weren't consuming enough protein? Or enough food in general? I mean, seriously, since there is no science of that caliber, then it is merely your speculation, and therefore, what does that mean? What does that translate to? Your opinion. The facts are that protein is insulinogenic. So is fat. Fat less so than protein. Protein less so than carbohydrates. So what? What? Eat more protein. Eat more food. If you really wanted to, which I don't believe that this is appropriate, but I mean, it really just depends on your, again, genotype and phenotype. I made a video about this. There is some potential nuance. It's not proven. It's a theory. So therefore, it's my opinion. If you're not an addict, you could try to have 20 grams of you could introduce 20 grams of carbohydrates into your diet if you really want to, but it's not required.
That 70 to 80% of our insulin requirement is not met.
According to what population? In what population? See, this is the problem, Rob. If you had just posited this as a theory, we all would have been a lot more content. But your video title is Why Humans Are Not Carnivores, and you're giving convicting claims based on a paper or a set of papers, whatever it may be, that are done on separate populations without disclosing the sample size, without disclosing the error band, without disclosing whether this was an inference extrapolated to a larger population, which is immediately inappropriate because you're dealing with cases that are not identical to each other, and you're dealing with confounders that aren't controlled for, and you're introducing more confounders and spurious variables when you perform an inference to that degree, to any degree, actually, to a larger population based on a small sample, okay? You cannot be convicting about this. Sorry. That's the irony of this entire video. What Rob is saying here, I've actually posited as a theory. What I said in my video was, we're the only species that even started to derive a significant amount of simple carbohydrates from plants in our diet 13,000 years ago. If we were doing that regularly for 13,000 years, that was clearly not enough to suppress our efficiency for gluconeogenesis, so that's out of the question. So it clearly means we weren't consuming too many at all, or at least it hasn't been enough time that we were consuming carbohydrates to the point, to a degree that would cause our efficiency for gluconeogenesis to go down via negative selection pressures, okay? Negative selection pressure because exogenous carbohydrates with a high efficiency for gluconeogenesis is a recipe for disaster. So it would actually cause harm, which would cause a negative selection pressure on the efficiency for gluconeogenesis to go down. Okay, it's not the same thing as your process for gluconeogenesis atrophying. That's different, okay? However, I said that it would mainly have to do with insulin secretion, if anything, based on my theory. And so I said, well, maybe 20 grams of carbohydrates depending on your genotype and phenotype. However, what did I say in that video? I said it's indicated to try literally everything else first, okay? Everything. So 13,000 years was clearly not enough time for us to adapt to a diet that contained a significant amount of simple carbohydrates, a standard diet, a mixed macronutrient diet. It clearly wasn't enough for carbohydrates to actually be required for the function of cells, because we have gluconeogenesis. If anything, it has to do with insulin secretion. And guess what? You can counteract that if you consume enough protein. It's just a matter of whether you can get that much down or not, whether it's practical, okay? That's what I said. You see the parallels here? But what did I say in the video? I said that there's no science to back that up, and that's a theory, and you can do what you want, and I would also warn against you doing that if you're an addict. So what the hell is this? Convicting claims because I must be right, because my opinion, because I'm obsessed with my models of the universe. Again, I posted a video about this. I shared a video about this on my community post tab and my community page from someone else that covers this very detailed and very in-depth, which is called Why Intellectuals Are Idiots. Yeah.
Not met by amino acids and...
No. You can't say not met, because the science you were referring to is not applicable to us. Is it? You don't understand statistical inference clearly.
Whereas in the carnivores, it is met completely. The insulin release is completely met.
In that sample or collective amount of samples in multiple different species, which begs the question as to whether all carnivores are the same. Let's say that you are necessarily correct about all this. Your video title would still be incorrect. Why humans are not carnivores. Because let me tell you, even if you're eating 50 grams of carbohydrates a day, you are still carnivorous. If you are not eating any other plants, and you are meat-based still. Everything else is meat and animal product derived. So what is your point, Rob?
By amino acids.
Yeah, so we already covered that.
Gluconeogenesis, the production of sugar from fat, needs insulin regulation.
No, Rob. The production of glucose from non-glucose precursors, which does not necessarily mean exclusively fat. In fact, that's the minority of where glucose is derived from endogenously. The vast minority, even in people that don't consume carbs. It's primarily from lactate, which makes sense if you understand human physiology. I'm not just basing that off of, a study from a small sample of people of different genotypes and phenotypes. I'm basing that off of basic physiology, Rob, which is what happens when glucose is used anaerobically. What do you produce? lactate, which is then exported from cells in order to preserve the pH of the cells within a certain interval range to maintain function of enzymes, and also to prevent allosteric inhibition of the glycolysis pathway. And then in order to preserve the pH of the blood, lactate is recycled and used to produce glucose again, and again, and again, and again. Cori cycle, anybody? With respect to glycogenolysis and all that. That's slightly different. You can really, effectively we're talking about the same thing when erythrocytes use glucose too, but anyway. So no, then it's glycerol from triglycerides in your stored fat, so that might be what he's talking about. But when I hear fat, I think of fatty acids. Then you've got amino acids, primarily during the fed state, or whenever you're actively starting to starve. Okay, when you're starving, that's whenever your body will start deriving glucose from your muscles. Or when your efficiency for gluconeogenesis is low because you're not adapted to a carnivorous diet. There's a key detail there. And then finally, odd chain fatty acids. Not even all fatty acids, odd chain fatty acids through propionyl-CoA. Basic physiology, folks.
And carnivores, pure carnivores, their bodies constantly, continuously perform gluconeogenesis.
So do ours. So I guess, yeah, you're right. All carnivores, because we're carnivores, Rob. This really is... Look, I respect nuance more than most people in the space. I really do. I steel man arguments. I think things through before I speak upon an issue. I do, okay? That doesn't mean I'm right about every single thing that I say on this channel. I'm sure that I've made some slip-ups, usually because I'm talking so fast. But nuance is only appropriate to accept whenever it's actually substantiated. This is not substantiated. If you hold this opinion, fine. State it as an opinion and state it as a theory, Rob. That's the problem. My channel primarily involves being convicting, as I am, about people being convicting about things they ought not to be convicting about. You'll notice that. The anger here comes from the overwhelming, overarching desire by people to establish order at the expense of responsibility. In other words, establishing order when it is not responsible to do so, because that is extremely dangerous. The most abstract view of that, in order to put this into people's heads, is asserting causality with associations. That is dangerous. Very dangerous. Okay? It's been proven throughout history to be dangerous. All right? That's my problem here.
Carnivore, their glucagon, which is the hormone that controls gluconeogenesis, is all...
Well, it influences gluconeogenesis, but controls implies dictatorship. It implies that it is the exclusive influencer when it is not. Rob, glucagon is a major hormonal influencer, but you've also got allosteric stimulators of the process, such as ADP, such as acetyl-CoA. I forget the others because it's been a long time since I've reviewed this stuff, but continue.
Elevated, and they're always in a state of ketosis.
So are human beings on a carnivorous diet, which I just covered in a recent video as well, and I'll be covering it very soon with Coach Steven directly about his anecdote. Human beings on a carnivorous diet are always in ketosis. In fact, after they consume protein, they go into even deeper ketosis. That's basic human physiology. Before people say, you're basing that assumption, you're generalizing that to the entire human population based on one anecdote, Coach Steven. No, it's grounded in basic human physiology. And I've covered this as well on the channel. I theorized this in videos far preceding Coach Steven's divulgence of his anecdote. Okay? Because I actually know how to think things through and be humble and say, I'm not saying this is a fact, but I hypothesize that it is. See how simple it is? See how easy it is to do that?
Around meal times, those carnivores will produce some sugar from amino acids from protein.
Yes, so do human beings, which is why your glucose will increase via gluconeogenic activity after consuming protein and fat. You know what else increases in amount? Ketones, which means you're not entering glycolysis. You're not entering in a glycolytic sort of metabolism. You're entering into deeper ketosis, Rob. Glucose increases because of the influence of glucagon, which is precisely why ketones also increase, because you're having an increase in beta oxidation at the level of the liver. There you go.
Have to support their blood sugar through this gluconeogenesis process. The glucagon is high, and those amino acids then trigger insulin that causes the sugar and the amino acids to get into their cells.
certain cells. Yes, correct. Absolutely fundamentally correct, Rob. So why are you saying that that is exclusive to all other carnivores and not us? Oh, because you're sitting here saying we're not carnivores. But you know what? Even if you were to say that, even if that were a fact, it is still true that this happens in our bodies as well. So why are you still drawing the distinction? It's just wrong in so many ways.
And insulin regulates glucagon. So the issue with
No, they don't regulate each other. They're secreted from the islets of Langerhans on the pancreas according to certain respective stimuli. They don't regulate each other. No, they exist in a ratio.
if they don't produce insulin, their glucagon is produced massive amounts of sugar, turn all that protein into energy. So
No, they're not turning protein into energy. No, they're not. False. Okay, now you're talking about a distinction. You're implying, you're introducing rather a distinction between energy and mass, which is important in human physiology. You do not turn protein into energy. You don't turn anything into energy in the body. You use substrates to create it, which is not the same thing. Okay, if you turned things into energy, you wouldn't have to breathe out carbon dioxide, which is mass, Rob. Okay, this has many different redounding effects, such as influence on pH balance in the body when you talk about carbon dioxide. This is why it's not captious to say such a thing. Okay, Rob? Ridiculous. Once again, they could be using protein to create energy, but the thing is you're implying that they're turning the protein into glucose, which is not creating energy. That's creating glucose, Rob. Wow. Anyway, yes, what you're saying is that if a carnivore, like a human being, has insufficient insulin that's released from protein, you're going to have a massive increase, or really, let's use less value judgment statements. You're going to have an increase in glucagon that is not as matched to the increase in insulin that you would see in other carnivores. That's his posit here. That's his hypothesis, which would have the consequence, given the influence on the IgG ratio, lowering it very, very low, of increasing production of glucose, ketones, etc. So sure. Now, what's your point, Rob?
they use insulin to regulate glucagon. And
No, it doesn't regulate. I know what you're saying, but it's not the best way of putting it.
this relationship is critically important.
The I to G ratio, yes, it is. The problem, Rob, is assuming that if you have a decrease in the I to G ratio, then you have insufficient insulin being secreted for physiological functions to be maintained, which is false, and I just covered this in a video that I did 2 weeks ago now. Rob, you can have a decrease in the I to G ratio, but an increase in the absolute level of insulin that is theoretically sufficient enough to preserve thyroid function and electrolyte maintenance. We're done.
They don't overproduce sugar.
We'll define overproduce, because your body is going to produce as much sugar as the chemical pressures exerted in the body cause to occur, really, according to the genes of the body. Those genes having evolved for billions of years, so they know exactly what they're doing. Define overproducing sugar.
But they produce enough sugar to survive on. So
Yes, there's no problem in our bodies with producing enough sugar for our cells to function. As you stated in the beginning, rightfully so, by the way. Your posit is different. Your posit is regarding insulin secretion. Okay, so you and I think very similarly about this, but you are being way too convicting, and you are also you're basically throwing your hands up in the air and going, oh, carnivore doesn't work, you need carbs, bleh. No, let's think this through more deeply.
insulin regulates this process by preventing runaway gluconeogenesis after a high protein.
Runaway gluconeogenesis. Define that. So this is just a bunch of theology being asserted as fact, Rob.
meal. And remember, carnivores mostly eat fairly lean protein. Most game that carnivores eat is fairly lean.
Right. So perhaps that has something to do with your purported fact that insulin isn't secreted as readily as it is in other carnivores in response to protein, if you're even correct in the first place, which is highly debatable, Rob. Which is why I've said it may not have anything to do with protein, as much as protein is much more insulinogenic in isolation than fat is. It may just have to do with you not eating enough food on a carnivore diet, Rob. There's way too much noise to assert with conviction your signal, okay? You just proved my point that all carnivores are different. All of them. Yes, so most carnivores, like cats, eat lean protein. From the inferences I've seen, human beings seem to be consuming moderate protein and high fat carnivore diets throughout history. So could that be an issue, Rob? Oh my God.
In carnivores, pure carnivores, insulin levels are low but steady, not fluctuating very much, preventing
So What?
from making too much glucose while
Define too much glucose. Okay, this is an inference, and therefore an opinion.
tissues get what they need. Switching off glucagon and making sure that the sugar is getting into the cells, into the
Fantastic. So could that mean that humans maybe should just be eating more? I mean, we say 1 meal a day, not because, well, really I say eat when you're hungry, actually. That's the first primary rule. I've said that you naturally sort of gravitate towards 1 meal a day, I've seen oftentimes, but you don't have to. Eat when hungry, Rob.
And as we said, in carnivores, glucagon is usually high alongside with a moderate and average.
Define moderate and define average. What are the absolute values here? These are relative terms that you're referring to. I mean, show us the studies. Let's see. Let's go into the description and see if he's even linked anything here. My screen recording's off right now, but I can tell you right now, there is nothing in his description that shows any papers whatsoever. There's one. Literature reviewed, LMHR studies. So it has not anything to do with his actual claims that he's made thus far. So anyway, yeah, there's no evidence that he's actually citing at all.
Level. Glucagon helps to maintain blood sugar by promoting gluconeogenesis and fat burning.
Yes, correct. Fact.
So your insulin level can't be too high because it blocks the use of fat or release of fat from the fat.
No, it doesn't block the use of fat. It inhibits the rate at which fat is tapped into, so to speak, accessed. Everything is a fader in the body. It's not an on-off switch, okay?
So it needs to be adequate to control glucagon, but not.
It doesn't control glucagon, Rob. These hormones don't control each other. They have antagonistic effects, which is not the same thing.
Enough to block fat mobilization. And the balance between low insulin and high glucagon lets carnivores stay in a fat-burning, ketogenic-like state most of the time.
Yes, exactly. Carnivores including human beings, by the way.
Very important. That's pure carnivore animals.
Yeah, like human beings. Great.
Strict carnivores or pure carnivores do trigger insulin from meat because they've evolutionarily adapted to use.
Yeah, so do human beings. And the reason I keep making this distinction, or I keep emphasizing that, is because you're making the erroneous distinction between human beings and carnivores, okay? So when you say carnivores, you don't mean human beings. Rob, what is your point?
Amino acids to create and release insulin.
We do the same damn thing, Rob.
Now, humans, while we've evolved, we've become facultative carnivores called omnivores. So,
like I said, there's an argument to make as to whether we're obligate or facultative, and it seems like we're obligate. There is a certain amount of evidence that, maybe we're just facultative. Either way, that distinction doesn't matter. He's trying to use this as a point to say, you have the capacity to be carnivore, so it doesn't mean that you should be a carnivore. Except, if you have the capacity to be a carnivore, then why are you making a damn video in the first place? Your title is Why Humans Are Not Carnivores. So are you now contradicting yourself?
Depend largely on a carnivore diet for nutrients.
And many other things, like a lack of anti-nutrients and toxins in plants that we don't seem to have genotypically evolved to withstand. That's another key point to add. Just because plants have toxins in them is not sufficient to say that we shouldn't be eating plants on a logical basis, because many plants, all plants, have toxins, but many animals are herbivores and eat the plants no problem. It's because they are actually evolved to withstand those toxins, that they've evolved alongside those plants. Human beings don't seem to have done so, based on physiological analyses on groups of people, but mainly because of associations of, the biggest one that I can think of is oxalate dumping. Almost every single plant has oxalic acid and oxalates in them, and look what happens when you cut them out. So many people having problems with those. I mean, there you go.
We cannot depend long-term on an absolute carnivore diet.
Okay, so just a bunch of nonsense, and we covered it.
We are not obligate carnivores.
That's your opinion. Oh my man. Wow.
Like wolves and lions and dolphins.
Well, again, begging the question fallacy there. Just because we're not like those animals in terms of our physiology and metabolism doesn't mean we aren't carnivores. Because all carnivores are different.
That have exclusively lived on meat for millions of years.
Just like human beings, we had very minimal amounts of large, fibrous tubers, inferentially speaking, ostensibly, during times of food scarcity, unsuccessful hunting. Because why the would you go out of your way to actually eat those? That's appetizing. Let me pull these roots out of the damn ground. Dirt and stringy wood fibrous nonsense.
Because our endocrine system,
Okay, so again, talking about hormones here.
that regulates hormones,
Okay.
requires GLP-1 triggering.
Yes, which is triggered by fatty acids, protein, and carbohydrates. All three.
By carbohydrates.
Whoa, so look at that. You see that tacit insertion there making people believe, oh, GLP-1 is secreted by, carbohydrates. Yes, and what else? Give me a break.
Release insulin. And
To release insulin. Yes. Yeah, okay, great. You know what releases those or stimulates those? Well, I just covered it. Rewind.
GLP-1 also is a major player in regulating glucagon. So the pure carnivores, protein triggers insulin, insulin modifies glucagon. In humans,
Does it modify glucagon, Rob? False.
that happens a little bit, but the majority, 70 to 80% of our insulin release is in response to sugar.
Who's our, Rob? You're referring to a study that was done on a population of people that had different genotypes and phenotypes to everyone else. Don't say our, because now when you say our, you're referring to a population parameter. You're referring to an inference based on a small sample, or even a large sample. I don't care. Small and large being relative terms. So we need to be absolute here, okay? Rob, I mean, we already covered this in the beginning, and I'm just repeating myself now. I'm waiting for anything else to come up.
Response to carbohydrates that trigger GLP-1 that switches on insulin and switches off glucagon. So while pure carnivores have high glucagon,
That is not necessarily the case either, Rob, because when you consume protein, that stimulates GLP-1, which stimulates insulin secretion, but protein also is involved in releasing lots of glucagon. Now, you could say that that's because, well, it releases less GLP-1 or stimulates less GLP-1, and that's why you don't get as much insulin and you get more glucagon. Fine, but then the question still remains as to whether or not that is a bad thing and will cause insufficient insulin in the first place. It's not a matter, once again, of the absolute level of insulin that's secreted from the pancreas in response to protein and fat. It's about whether or not that amount is sufficient to maintain physiological functions. Okay.
fluctuating insulin levels like this, they're always about the same. Humans require this. We require much more C.
According to whom, on the basis of what? Rob? I almost called him Paul. I'm not kidding.
We need insulin to get the sugar into our cells and to switch off glucagon, but we need low insulin levels.
No. Once again, I covered that in the beginning. You don't require insulin to usher glucose into cells in general. You require insulin to usher glucose through GLUT4 into cells. Okay?
High glucagon when we are on ketosis between meals because we are living on fat, and the glucagon is producing a little bit of sugar from gluconeogenesis. So
I'm frankly, guys, I'm zoning out because he just keeps repeating himself, and we already covered everything. Everything here. We require insulin for maintaining bodily functions like electrolyte maintenance, thyroid hormone production. He wants to sit here and say, oh, well, you also need it to control how much glucose is actually produced as a consequence of glucagon when you consume protein and fat. You know, to sort of counteract the effects of glucagon. That's why I keep saying, well, insulin inhibits glucagon, which is just the wrong way of putting it. They're antagonistic, so the ratio is important. Sure, you can add that in there too. Fine. Well, it turns out that whenever you consume protein, you're secreting insulin and glucagon. So what the is the point here?
carnivores do not require carbohydrate-derived GLP-1 spikes for insulin release.
Correct. That includes us. Rob, me.
Their beta cells are directly sensitive to amino acids and fatty acids without needing GLP-1 as a major intermediary.
Okay, our beta cells also have the ability to respond directly to amino acids and fatty acids. This entire thing is a begging the question fallacy, as it usually is in these videos. You're operating under a false foundation. You have to question whether the foundation you're standing on is appropriate and or accurate.
Humans without carbohydrates long-term.
Define long-term. Okay, same questions, same absence of answers here.
carbohydrates long term. So your long term sustainable carnivores, GLP-1 signaling decreases because they're not triggering it with carbohydrates. And not only does GLP-1
Oh my God, Rob. It's triggered by protein and fat as well.
signaling go down, the number of upper intestine GLP-1 cells goes down.
So a phenotypic adaptation, which means that you can phenotypically adapt in the opposite direction if you change your behaviors as well. Right. So let's rewind and see, just get a better idea of what he's saying. I need to make sure I'm hearing this right.
Triggering it with carbohydrates. And not only does GLP-1 signaling go down, the number of upper intestine GLP-1 cells goes down.
Oh, okay. So actually what he's saying is that if you don't consume carbohydrates, that happens. So no, you wouldn't want to reverse phenotypically adapt by consuming carbohydrates, obviously. What you would want to do is actively perhaps consume more protein and fat. Rob, eat more food.
So if you suddenly eat a carbohydrate load, you're going to see a massive spike in insulin. You're not going to clear that insulin. It's called a Kraft pattern 5 because...
Okay, actually, Rob, if you're not consuming carbohydrates for a significant period of time, what's going to happen is you're going to have a downregulation of GLUT transporters of all types that are involved in glucose administration on pancreatic beta cells, muscle cells, fat cells, every cell of the body. So actually, you're not going to see a massive spike in insulin immediately, typically, at all. It's going to lag a little bit because insulin is primarily secreted most readily through GLUT2 transporters. So if you have a downregulation of those, it's going to take a bit of time. But let's say it does spike eventually. Okay, it spikes to try and get that glucose down. There's going to be a lag time behind that glucose or that insulin spike and the glucose trough, because you need an increase in the GLUT transporters as well as an increase in the production of GLUT4 transporters and a recruitment of those to the plasma membrane mediated by insulin and the glucose because you haven't been consuming it. That's called peripheral or physiological insulin resistance, which is completely normal and not a problem. Your tolerance for something decreases when you don't consume it. There you go. Does that mean that you should be consuming everything that you're intolerant to? I guess I should continue going and consuming a bunch of food dyes and cyanide in my almonds.
GLP-1's just not being produced and therefore insulin...
No, lie. False. Rob, it is being produced. You're sitting here saying it's insufficient, which I'd love to see evidence of that.
Being reduced. So the beta cells become less responsive without the carb triggering GLP-1 reinforcement.
Well, is less responsive insufficient?
I call that physiologic insulin suppression.
Wow, we covered it. We covered it, Rob. We're done with this, okay? Your theory may be correct in certain people, okay? Certain people. You have no evidence to support these claims, however. None. And even if you did, that wouldn't mean that human beings are not carnivores. It would mean that we are carnivores, just in a different form, with slightly different physiology, with a slightly different indicated diet or dietary approach. Rob, okay? You're getting too infatuated with your theory in believing that it's a fact. Sorry.
Insulin suppression. You've heard me talk about that a lot.
Well, a little bit.
So humans require GLP-1s from small amounts of dietary carbohydrates to be able to...
No, you do not know that for a fact, Rob. You don't. This is the problem. Say that you hypothesize that. Say that you theorize that. That's different than saying you do require it, because then you're fear-mongering.
Clear the sugar that gets produced by gluconeogenesis from the animal products we're eating. Think that one through.
I have thought it through, and we already covered it, okay? Is a reduction in GLP-1 activity necessarily in every single person, or any person for that matter, indicative of insufficient amounts of GLP-1? You have not provided evidence of that. Trial and error, Rob. People will have to figure out what's right for them, okay? Stop fear-mongering.
High GLP-1 dependence, and we have not adapted completely to a no-carbohydrate diet.
You do not have evidence of that, Rob, okay? And also, if 13,000 years was enough time for us to require 10 or 20 grams of carbohydrates to stimulate insulin secretion to a sufficient degree to maintain physiological processes that require insulin, well, does that not mean that we can't adapt to a zero carbohydrate diet eventually? Again, 13,000 years isn't too much time, evolutionarily speaking. Okay, Rob?
We need a low carbohydrate diet with a lot of protein and fat, predominantly fat.
See, again, Rob, I don't really find that too offensive. But the problem is you being convicting about this stuff, pointing to a bunch of science that doesn't prove your points. This is a theory. I posited a very similar theory, if not identical, months ago. It's a theory.
Adaptation to a low carb to a no carbohydrate diet.
By the way, I also said in the video once again that it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, which is why you should try everything in your power to not consume the carbohydrates first. Do every protocol, okay? Don't be too afraid of having 20 grams unless you're an addict, in which case you would have to really be careful with which forms of carbohydrates you're eating that in. Don't choose anything sweet.
Partial. And if it's complete, we downregulate both insulin and GLP-1 over time. And
okay, we already covered that. Begs the question as to whether that's insufficient for maintaining physiological function, because I can tell you right now, I consume very minimal carbohydrates, very minimal. And for I think 2 years straight, by the way, almost 2 years, I had none at all. So anyway,
blood sugar starts to rise, causing inflammation in the blood vessels.
No, not necessarily, Rob, because if it is encoded for by the genes, it ought to be happening. That is a theory that you've put forth, that it's because of people not consuming sufficient amounts of carbohydrates.
Plaque formation in the heart. So the paradox is that with insulin suppression on the pure carnivore human diet, it's not very different in terms of cardiovascular inflammation than...
No, that's absolutely ridiculous, Rob, because most people's blood sugars on a carnivore diet are still quite low, even by conventional standards. That is nonsensical, Rob.
The people on a standard American diet who are insulin suppressed.
No, that is an egregiously false claim in order to reinforce your own ideology in your brain.
Our evolutionary adaptation is to require a carnivore dominant diet or a carnivore based diet.
No, a carnivore diet, Rob, even according to your conclusions here, it would be a carnivore diet.
But a mix of some form of carbohydrate, be that the sugar in milk. That's why there's sugar in milk, folks. That's why there's sugar in milk.
No, that is your theory and opinion, Rob. Why are you being convicting about things right now when you have no ability to be convicting about things? There's sugar in milk for, ostensibly, the rapid growth of infants, and in humans, especially, it fattens the babies up. So if anything, that... Jesus.
To trigger that insulin. And in fact, pure carnivore animals, their milk has a much lower level of glucose and glycogen. Think that one through, folks.
Glycogen?
Much higher protein and fat ratio. Carnivore milk. You go out there and you milk
Carnivore milk. Okay.
friendly lion, and you'll find there's very little sugar in there.
Okay.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yes, very interesting, Rob. Babies get fat, okay?
So in carnivores, their glucagon is higher at baseline than it is in humans. Insulin...
Humans eating what diet and doing what, Rob? Hell.
Sensitivity is different. And it's...
Oh my god, there's so many problems here that I've already covered. I'm about to stop the damn video. I'm really about to stop it. First of all, you're saying they're different while comparing humans that are eating species inappropriate, species unspecific diets to a group of carnivores that are eating a species appropriate, species specific diet for their speciation. There's also genotypic and phenotypic differences between the humans themselves in the one group they're in, and there's genotypic and phenotypic differences between the other group if you chose one species, and there's even more error if you chose multiple different species and put them into one group. Then you're assuming that since they're different, which we already covered why that would be the case. Okay, we already covered the errors already. But let's say that it was completely controlled. Genotypically identical and phenotypically identical human beings versus genotypically and phenotypically identical carnivore species, and comparing humans to each species in separate studies. Let's say that that was actually attained, and they're still different. That begs the question as to whether or not human beings are not carnivores, Rob, and they still are. Wow.
Tuned to respond to smaller and steadier releases of sugar from the liver rather than boluses of sugar from the from the intestine. In pure carnivores, ketone metabolism is upregulated and permanent. Humans should cycle through ketosis, but not all.
No, Rob, you don't have any evidence for that. That is your theory and opinion.
Ketosis. And the GLP-1s and the GIP hormones, the incretin hormones, are far more important in humans than they are in animals.
So you believe. We already covered the differences that result from comparing different species together, and especially comparing different species that have phenotypic and genotypic differences amongst each member of each species, okay?
Animals. So this is just so important.
Okay. Yes, insulin secretion is important, Rob. You're boring me.
Yes, certain amino acids like arginine, leucine, glutamine can also stimulate insulin in humans only about
Oh, wow.
%.
In what group of people, Rob?
So it's very modest, and it requires GLP-1 and GIP. And that, folks,
So what, Rob? Oh my God. Amazing stuff here. Truly amazing stuff.
while I am carnivore-based for nutrition,
You're carnivore. Rob, whether you like it or not, you are carnivore.
low amount of carbohydrate that I do consume for exactly that purpose.
Yeah, and you can go ahead and do that, and that's probably not going to do anything too deleterious to your physiology. You may even be correct in your theory, but it's a theory, and to tell everyone to do exactly what you are doing because of a theory that is not substantiated by scientific evidence, because, well, it's very, very, very difficult to do that with anything, is irresponsible.
Because in humans, beta cells are tuned primarily to glucose sensing. The GLUT2 transporter, which has a low affinity, high capacity,
He's going to cover something that I already said about 30 minutes ago in this video.
glucose transporter role occurs in the beta cells.
Wow. Rewind my video because I said exactly that.
So true in the pure carnivores.
Yes, however, you know what, Rob? You're lucky that I'm this far into this video. Humans have a higher GLUT2 expression on their beta cells, especially when they are consuming lots of carbohydrates. Rob, that is your problem here. You are basing your inferences on populations that are not phenotypically adapted to a high-fat, moderate-protein carnivore diet, or any carnivore diet, frankly. This is ridiculous.
Glucose, our beta cells become quiescent. They don't release insulin adequately.
That is your opinion. You have no evidence to support that claim. And as soon as you make another stupid claim like that, my affinity, my probability for staying on this video is going to continuously decrease.
So humans have a reliance not only on GLP-1, but also on GLUT2 receptors in beta cells to sense that blood sugar. Carnivores don't have that.
No, you're talking about a population of human beings that is eating a different diet. Okay, Rob? Your expression of those transporters decreases when you don't consume glucose. Okay, there's CD36 transporters on the outsides of beta cells as well. Okay, Rob? There you go, Rob. Hell, really? What you would have to do is you have to get a large group of people that is sufficient, that's sufficient to causing sufficient statistical power in your study, adapt them from whatever diet they're on to a carnivore diet that best approximates from every inference we have a species-appropriate, species-specific diet, then try and tailor it to their needs according to their appetite, whatever, okay, for a long enough period of time to where the levels of physiological adaptations that are observed starts to bottom out. You get a diminishing return here with adaptation activity until it's stagnant and static for a sufficient period of time, okay? Then what you'd have to do, and there's still limitations even there, but then what you have to do is measure their what I've been calling the genotypic maximum. What they have to do is they have to measure the ratio of GLUT2 to CD36 and all these other transporters on all of their cells, in this case beta cells, and then compare that to every other carnivorous species as well to see, okay, does that match up with the phenotypic adaptation to the genotypic maximum adaptation to a carnivore diet in these carnivores? And if it doesn't, well, then maybe you then have something. You have an inference there. But first of all, you then have to repeat those studies on multiple different populations over and over and over again and yield the same result with minimal error, with an adequate signal-to-noise ratio, which is arguably 5 and up. Okay? That's what you would have to do. And even then, that begs the question, as to whether humans should continuously every day have a small amount of carbohydrates, or if they should go like a month or 2 or 3 months without carbohydrates and then binge on hundreds of grams of carbohydrates. And the reason I say that, is because evolutionarily that actually is what we would do. We'd go months, it seems, without carbohydrates, and then we would come across it and be like, oh, okay, hundreds of grams, let's go. Maybe a day, maybe 2 days while you're in that area, and then done. We know we did that. So there's something. The problem is that we live in a time of abundance, and therefore if you tell everyone to do that, the chances of them binging on hundreds of grams of carbohydrates for 2 days and then stopping carbohydrates again for 3 or 4 months, I would presume is quite minimal, quite low. Okay? Hell.
Have the GLUT2 signaling, and a long-term zero carbohydrate diet in humans.
Define long-term. Define humans. Rob, what kinds of humans? Where? What were they doing?
Downregulates both GLUT4, GLUT2 expression, GLUT4 in the muscles, GLUT2 in our beta cells.
Yes, it downregulates GLUT4 and it downregulates GLUT2, obviously, because you're not consuming glucose, Rob. What the hell is this?
And GLP-1, which makes us insulin suppressed and hyperglycemic.
Okay, it can suppress the degree to which you can release insulin. The question still remains as to whether the amount that is still released is sufficient to be maintaining physiological functions. You have not answered that question because you can't. You think it doesn't. I think that it may not in certain individuals, depending on their ancestral lineage.
And then that high level of blood sugar has the same body effects in our lean mass hyperresponder patients as it does in the standard American diet patients, explaining the rise in soft plaque in the studies.
No, that is your opinion, Rob. Absolutely unacceptable. Now you've pissed me off. No, Rob, that is your opinion. The ketogenic diet concerned in that study that you're referring to wasn't even explicitly stated. It wasn't clarified what they meant by ketogenic diet. Because trust me, ketogenic diet can be a plant-based keto diet. So what would explain the plaque buildup there? Well, it could be plant toxins and inflammation. Way too much noise, Rob. Way too much noise.
When humans eat a small amount of carbohydrates, our insulin is high enough.
Define small. Our insulin is higher than other animals? Is that what he's going to say?
Glucagon is low. That is
high and glucagon is low. Yeah. If you eat enough of it.
Not pure carnivore animals, where their baseline glucagon is always high.
The comparison here is completely inappropriate and it has been throughout this entire video. And we already covered why.
We humans only eat protein. We get a small insulin trigger and a major glucose.
Depending on who you are and how adapted you are to a higher protein diet, Rob. Why is this so difficult for you to understand? I'm not saying that your theory is necessarily incorrect. I'm saying that you don't have the science to support it. And therefore you should exhibit some humility and stop saying you do.
Trigger. And that is inadequate to clear our blood sugar.
That is your Okay, I'm done. If I have to say that is your opinion one more time, I'm going to lose my mind. What we have here is another pseudo-intellectual, or another intellectual gone rogue, being infatuated with his own ideology and his own theories. Okay, it's really easy for human beings to get carried away with that. It really is. But it doesn't mean it's acceptable when it happens. Okay, this is a theory. So what is the summary for you today? Okay, let me provide you with the summary. The summary is this. Rob Cywes believes, given his patients that he's seen in his practice over time, that a ketogenic, zero carbohydrate, carnivorous diet that at least remotely approximates a species-appropriate, species-specific diet for human beings across the entirety of our genome is very effective initially, and then eventually you will have to reintroduce carbohydrates into the diet. And his reasoning for that is because sure, you can produce the glucose that you require for your physiological needs. It has nothing to do with carbohydrates not being available to the body. Your body will still yield glucose from endogenous sources. His worry, his concern, is regarding insulin secretion. He believes that you'll secrete insufficient insulin to maintain physiological functions like thyroid hormone production and electrolyte maintenance, even though he didn't mention it in this video, he's mentioned it in others. And he believes that the ratio of insulin to glucagon will be too low, so you'll have a lot of glucagon and too little insulin to counteract glucagon's effects on glucose production, meaning that you're going to have high blood glucose that causes arterial damage. So he says that paradoxically, you'll actually see a situation where people that are insulin suppressed, which is what this is, he's coined it that way, people that are insulin suppressed ironically, are going to have the same issues that people that are on a standard American diet have with heart disease risk. Because, well, glucose is higher. You're going to be causing damage to the endothelial tissue, and you're going to be causing plaque buildup because of inflammation to the tissue. That is his theory. Now, as a theory, to me personally, I've actually said the same thing months ago to a less fear-mongering degree, and in a far more humble degree. I said that we're the only species of carnivores because we still are carnivores, and Rob insists on saying that we're not when we still are, even by his own conclusions as to what we ought to be eating that would still be carnivorous, just a different style of carnivory. We're different than every other animal in terms of our ability to reason. Given our ability to reason, we started to learn how to cultivate plants for consumption about 13,000 years ago from anthropological records due to ostensibly an extinction of the megafauna and other animals that we were relying on for food. That was when we started to consume a significant amount of carbohydrates. Now, lots of things happened as a result of that. Decreased stature and robustness. We had many structural issues result from that. But the idea has been, well, 13,000 years was clearly not enough for our efficiency for gluconeogenesis to decrease. Not at all. Which indicates that it wasn't a sufficient amount of time for us to have had an indication for exogenous carbohydrates in the human diet. But it could have been enough for us to require some carbohydrates for insulin secretion if people have an issue with it. That's a theory. There's no evidence to support the claim, and that's how theories really are. It can't be proven or disproven. It has to be trial and error. And so what I said in the video was try everything in your might not to do it, because it's better to do that than to just jump on the carbohydrate bandwagon, especially if you have a propensity for being an addict, okay? And also because there's differences between every single person. It depends on your ancestral lineage. Not everyone, ancestrally speaking, if you trace back your ancestral lineage, consumed the same amount of agriculture as other members did. And so that's why some people have a lactase enzyme in their stomachs and some people don't, because some people consume lots of dairy and some people didn't. So to make a general claim about everyone requiring some carbohydrates is just ridiculous. It really is. The problem that Rob has is false comparisons, believing that science can even inform upon truth and causality, statistical inference, a failure to understand statistical inference, a failure to understand the inferential statistics in the area of human nutrition science is completely fallacious, considering you cannot responsibly extrapolate results from a sample to an entire population at large, okay? These people do not understand the intricacies of the science, and he's become infatuated with his own ideology and is now making general claims and telling people that they require carbohydrates. That is the problem. Say that it's a theory, say that everyone is different, and that probably isn't the case, and also say that exogenous carbohydrates are technically a toxin, okay, and therefore, if you do have some indication for it, don't test that out by immediately jumping to carbohydrates and consuming them. Try everything in your power to not have to consume them, because it's obviously safer to consume protein and fat. Maybe you just need to eat more. That seems to be the major culprit. People not eating enough food, okay? That's it. His theory may be correct. That's not the problem here. The problem is being convicting about a theory that has no evidence to substantiate it. So, if you want to consume 20 grams of carbohydrates, go right ahead. Fine. In fact, even if you want to consume 300, I would highly recommend not doing that. But if you want to do that, go ahead. If you want to be a vegan, go ahead. What we do on this channel is we cover what science can indicate and does indicate and what it doesn't indicate, what it can't inform upon and what it can inform upon. What we do is we crack down on people being convicting about things they ought not to be convicting about because there's insufficient evidence to support their claims and substantiate them. And we, through very sagacious methods, infer things carefully and with humility about what we ought to be consuming and what we ought not to be consuming as a species of Homo sapiens sapien across the board for every member of our genome. That's what we do on this channel, which is a carnivore approach. 20 grams of carbohydrates in your diet, in your meat-based diet, is still a carnivore diet, by the way. I keep wanting to emphasize that. That's still carnivore. I would say a maximum cutoff should be 50. I don't really see a reason for anyone else having to have 50 grams of carbohydrates, okay? Or if you want to, you can go 6 months without having any and then go and have 2 days worth of eating hundreds of grams. If you want to be truly ancestrally consistent whenever it came to some members of our species going months, maybe even a year without having any carbohydrates and then stumbling upon a beehive, okay? See, people like Paul Saladino will say this to justify their consumption of hundreds of grams a day, which is absolutely ridiculous and is clearly just to justify their addiction. Here, we're being very objective. The problem with that idea, though, is once again, if you're an addict, since we live in a time of abundance, the chances of you actually going only a day or two of consuming that many carbohydrates is quite minimal, I believe. Okay, we need to be careful with this. We need to actually be adroit, analytical, tactical here, okay? That was the problem with Dr. Rob Cywes' video here. His theory may very well be correct. It also may not be correct, but it is not necessarily true, which is what he wants you to believe. He's getting carried away with his own ideology. So, with that being said, don't fall for fear-mongering propaganda. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you're not subscribed to the channel, what are you doing? Buy my book, Contraindicated, by the way, if you want to learn more about this, okay? A closer look and revision of mainstream health axioms that have perpetuated illness, disorder, and disease for over a century. If you have not bought that book already, second edition is out now. Link in the description below for paperback, hardcover, audiobook, and hopefully by the time this is out, the ebook, because I've gotten that submitted on Barnes & Noble. You can buy the ebook on Barnes & Noble today. You can buy it on Rakuten Kobo, okay? You can also buy it on Amazon through Kindle under a separate title. You'll find, if you look the book up, there will be two separate titles. One is the Kindle version, one is the hardcover, paperback, and audiobook versions. If you're someone that is on Google Play Books, though, that is in the works. So, yes, actually I should say the ebook is available now. Finally. So if you, my dear viewer, have been awaiting this for a long time, well, your patience has been rewarded. And also, one final thing. There are a lot of charlatans online saying things that don't really hold up, that aren't able to be substantiated whatsoever by people that genuinely believe that they have proper authority and have an ability to comprehensively, competently speak upon topics relating to the areas and pertaining to the areas of human nutrition, human diet, etc., etc. If you want to help fight back, as you obviously have a duty to do, we have an ability for you to basically get some credibility under your belt and be internationally recognized and accredited, which allows you to get insurance more easily as well, which is important, which is through a carnivore certification program headed by Carnivore Coach Peter. Now, what is this program? Well, it allows you to become internationally accredited as a carnivore coach. Most of the time, so here's the thing. To call yourself a coach requires nothing. You can call yourself a coach right now, legally speaking. But if you actually want to be internationally accredited and have your title of coach actually be an official title and be recognized as such, allowing you to get insurance more easily and other things as well, our program is the program to go to for that exact thing. We have a website in the description below to learn more about this. If you would like to learn even more about it, however, I interviewed Coach Peter himself a few months ago, and I'll link that video in the top right corner of the screen so you can check that out, learn who he is, more about the program, and more about why we're doing this in the first place, why it's important, why you should go and sign up. And also, if you're curious about signing up for such a program, Peter's social media and socials in general are linked in the description below for you to get a hold of him so you can negotiate a plan with him regarding that. As much as appealing to authority is a fallacy, it doesn't change the fact that people are still going to do that. So you might as well be a responsible authority figure. So we have that option available for you, and it's a great community. Peter's been coaching people for over 20 years, so it is absolutely something that you should check out, in my humble opinion. So, with that being said, join me next time when we're reacting to more people being infatuated and becoming infatuated with their own personal theories about things, not recognizing that it is irresponsible for them to assert it as fact. So, till then.